So good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Meredith Lilly, and I'm a senior fellow with CIGI. So on behalf of CIGI, I'd like to welcome you all here today. I'm also a professor at Carleton University at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. I'm pleased to welcome all of you here today, and especially our special guest, Ambassador Sofia Ösmark of Sweden. Before I say a few words of introduction about the ambassador, I'd just like to welcome all of you. I know that we have several diplomats in the room, as well as staff from various government departments and several agencies. Several civil society organizations are represented this evening, as well as members of the private sector. So on behalf of CIGI, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us here this evening. On a personal note, I'm especially pleased to welcome the ambassador today of all days. It's an auspicious day for the Canada-Europe relationship because today is the first day of implementation of the Canada-EU trade agreement, and that's something that's quite close to my heart. It's an agreement that I worked on for a long time. And of course, in order to tie the implementation of CETA into tonight's event, I would say that CETA contains a very strong labor chapter, and it protects workers and ensures strong working conditions for workers on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I think that it represents a good reason to celebrate. We're, of course, gathered to have an important discussion on the global deal that Ambassador Ösmark coordinates, which is the Multi-Stakeholder Partnership for Decent Work and Inclusive Growth based at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, prior to taking on her current position, the ambassador worked at the Prime Minister's office as a senior policy officer and was also acting head of the Office for Strategic Development. Ambassador Ösmark has extensive experience in international cooperation, having headed the work on global migration at the Ministry of Justice. She worked at Gavi, which is the Vaccine Alliance, the International Task Force on Global Public Goods, as well as various positions in the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Ösmark holds a master's degree in political science. In terms of our format this evening, we'll hear from the ambassador. She'll speak for less than 30 minutes, and that will give us lots of time to have a lively exchange and to ask questions about the initiative and about her work. There's a reception following, so I hope that you'll stay and join me for that. So, Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Professor, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here in Canada and to be here tonight. It's actually my first time in Canada, which is a pity, I would say, that I haven't been able to see this pretty country before, but I'm very pleased to be here today. And the reason that I'm here is to explore a little bit more how we can work more closely together with Canada on the global deal for decent work and inclusive growth. And I'm actually coming directly from New York, where I've been with the Prime Minister during the UN General Assembly, and we had a one-year anniversary of the global deal. There was a big event on Monday with several heads of states and government, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, representative of business, trade unions, the head of Oxfam, for a discussion on how do we go about to take the global deal forward even more, and how can we build the momentum for this partnership. I was thinking about speaking a little bit here today, but I also want to hear your questions and discussions. I will focus my intervention on 4 points, and a little bit first speaking on what are the challenges that we see on the global labor market, but also in terms of the inequality that is growing in some instances of the world. And secondly, about what is actually the global deal. The professor mentioned that it's a multi-stakeholder partnership, but what does that mean and how do we take it forward? And thirdly, also speak a little bit about the business case for social dialogue and the business case for global deal from a private sector perspective. And then lastly, a little bit of the way ahead and some of the research work that we are working on now. But the idea behind the global deal, this was something that our Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, who is a former trade union leader in Sweden, so he has a strong background in labor market relations. He had this vision of making globalization work better for everyone, or at least for more people in the world. So that's the long-term kind of very long-term vision of the global deal. And we have seen that globalization and free trade has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, but we also see at the same time that we haven't been effective in distributing the gains of globalization. And today's statistics actually show that 8 men in the world own the same wealth as 3.6 billion of the poorest people in the world. And I think that's quite a depressing figure, actually. So I hope we can do something about that, and the global deal can contribute to that. In terms of inequality, I mean, we see a growing inequality not only between countries, but also within countries. And we also see the problems that a growing inequality creates. I mean, it creates social unrest, it impedes social economic development, and we also see that basic human rights are denied around places around the world. But we also see that there is a growing skepticism about globalization and free trade, and also about a growing populist force in many countries, even in Sweden. And in UK, inequality has been marked as the single one most important factor behind the Brexit and the UK's going out of the European Union. So I think inequality is on the top of the agenda, not only in developing countries, but also in all our European countries. And in order to create a more inclusive and sustainable growth, we have to build trust in our institution. We have to build a sense of people feeling included in society and feeling included in decision making. And I think there is a growing international recognition from institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank that we can not only look at growth, but we have to look at an inclusive growth that is sustainable. Otherwise, you won't have a long-term gain. And I mean, I think there is also a growing recognition that inequality is not only it's not only about a moral issue, it's also about an economic issue, and it's economically smart to have a more sustainable and inclusive growth. And I think also if we look at a changing world of work and the society and the different technology and the changing landscape that we see, inequality and having the people in the center of our development will be even more important. Looking at the labor market, today we have around 1.5 billion workers in insecure jobs or in the informal sector, and most of them are women. So this is something that we also want to address with the global deal. But not only the informal jobs and the insecurity on the labor market, there are also debt and worldwide, I think it's over almost 2.5 million work-related deaths at the workplace every year. So we need to create the work environment that is highlighting the issues of labor rights, the issues of human rights. And I think also that men and women need equal opportunities, not only in employment, but also in decision-making and in making those decisions. But I think when we created the global deal, it was also about creating jobs. We now have 2 million people unemployed around the world. And with the changing world of work, where there will be differences, technology will take some of the opportunities, but other work might occur. We need to look at how can we create more sustainable employment going forward. So that's also another issue that we want to address. And for inclusive growth to work, we have to think about new and innovative ways of working. There is evidence that strong trade union organization, labor legislation, and access to equal education can actually reduce inequality. So that's one of the backgrounds to the global deal. And I think we have to see that cooperation and trust on the labor market and a society as a whole can really help build a globalization that makes more people benefit. And now I talked about inequality a lot, but the global deal has two bones, I would say, both the decent work agenda and the inclusive growth. And on the decent work agenda, which has 4 pillars, it's about job creation, rights at work, social protection, and social dialogue. And it's actually the social dialogue pillar of this decent work agenda where we have seen the hardest area to reach progress. And that's where the global deal comes in. This was an initiative, as I said, by the Prime Minister, and it focused on bringing together the decent work and inclusive growth agenda. It was developed together with OECD and ILO to get both of those organizations' different perspectives and all the knowledge that they have in building this. And the Prime Minister from the beginning wanted to create initial core groups of states, unions, businesses, and other organizations to launch this together. So he approached a couple of leaders around the world, which one was your Prime Minister, Trudeau, who has accepted our Prime Minister's invitation to join this partnership. So the partnership was building on countries from Bangladesh to Colombia, Chile, South Africa, Ethiopia. So it was really a regional representation from all around the world. So it was a big launch at the UN General Assembly last year, and we are then building on that and hoping that we will have more and more partners going forward. The focus on this multi-stakeholder partnership is exactly on social dialogue and sound industrial relations, and how that can be a vehicle for creating decent work, quality jobs, and increased productivity, and in the extension, greater equality and an inclusive growth. And the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven of Sweden, often talks about the win-win-win opportunity that the global deal offers. A win for workers, a win for employers, but also a win for society as a whole when you have the inclusion and you feel that you have a more included workforce. The global deal builds very much on voluntary commitments by the different partners that joins. It's not a legally binding framework, it's not a new organization, but it's rather creating a momentum, a political drive at the highest level for these issues. And then from country to country, from business to business, it's up to the different actors to define what is the global deal for me, what is my deal to the global deal. It is what we see as a partnership for the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, which I'm sure all of you know, with its 17 goals. And exactly goal 17 is pointing to the importance of creating partnership between different stakeholders in order to achieve the goals. And we see the global deal as a concrete input to several of the goals in this agenda, but foremost there is a specific goal, goal 8, which is on decent work and inclusive growth. And here we see that the global deal can play a real importance in driving that goal forward. There is no actual partnership that is broad in that sense. There are several, of course, many partnerships around the world on specific issues, but the global deal as an umbrella for SDG 8 we hope we will achieve. Underpinning the global deal is a declaration of support. So people are not signing, as I said, it's not a legally binding document, but partners are asked to associate with the declaration of support. And this declaration states what it means for states to join, and that means ratifying or taking steps towards ratifying ILO's core conventions. For companies, it means being prepared to negotiate locally, nationally, regionally, or globally, and also work in sustainability way. But it also puts a pressure on trade unions to act in accordance with social responsibility, but also contributing to the overall goal of the company. So I think it's a partnership that puts pressure on all the different actors to make the world better and creating this trustful space among the different actors. I said it builds very much on voluntary agreements, but we also have a coordination unit which is now currently placed, and I'm heading it in Sweden. And that unit, what we can do is creating platforms for dialogue, both at the global level, but also around different countries that has joined the global deal. We almost now have 50 partners, and I know that our Prime Minister takes up this in his bilateral consultations with his counterparts around the world, and there is a lot of interest also from France, Japan, and other countries to join. So we hope there will be more soon, but also businesses and others. But what we can do from a coordination view is try to see where are the knowledge gaps and where can we actually have something more to say that is not already done by the OECD, ILO, or any other international organization, and create that kind of knowledge. But it is also very much a partnership. So we are relying on the input from the partners on where do you see that the global deal can add value to the variety of organizations and partnerships that is out there. So we are now in still, I would say, in a starting phase, but I will come back to some of the research that we're doing. I said that in the core of the global deal is social dialogue. And I remember when I speak about this in Sweden, which has one of the longest cultures of social dialogue, people do not still know what social dialogue means. So I was just thinking I should say a few words of that. I mean, it's defined as all types of negotiations on the labor market between different parties. So it's not only tripartite consultation, it can be two parties, and it can be broad. It can happen in the informal sector, it can happen in the formal sector. And I think there is sometimes a misinterpretation that social dialogue can only happen in countries where you have a large trade union organizations, such as Sweden, for example. But it's about creating that space of dialogue and negotiations. It's about collective bargaining, of course, but it's also about workplace cooperation and creating the training on the workplace. So I think it's very broad, and I think that's where it can also fill a role. And having this being applied in the different countries from the different contexts, I think is very important. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but it's really what works in this particular context, whether it's a country with a large informal sector or not. There is also a growing recognition that in order to deal with the technology and the changes of the world of work, you need to have a dialogue to deal with that. Maybe people will lose their jobs, and if they do that without feeling included in the decision-making, that can be a societal gamble, I would think, if they feel included, and that would fuel populist movements even more. So I think there is a growing recognition, the role of dialogue and the role of social dialogue in the changing world of work, but also on education and skills and matching those skills of the new technologies. And here, if there is a cooperation between the partners on the labor market, you can create the education needed for the work that is out there. But as I said, it's also about the transition from the informal to the formal economy and using social dialogue as a tool for that. And for example, in India, as probably many of you know, there is one of the largest organization of self-employed women. So it's called SEVA, the Self-Employment Women's Association. It is 1.5 million members, women, that are self-employed, that have organized themselves in order to still have their rights, a fair wage, and so on. So this is an example of how you can work also in the formal sector on this. And there are several research that really shows that strengthened social dialogue and trust between employers, workers, and government usually deliver very good results on decent work, but also on productivity and inclusive growth. So here we feel that the global deal can actually play an important role. But to be a little bit more concrete, so what are the kind of commitments that the global deal means? And if I take my own country, Sweden, what are the commitments that we are doing? We are working very hard on inequality issues and decent work in our national policies, EU level and global level. And in Sweden, we are working with companies such as H&M and Scania, and we have created a national global deal platform to also discuss these issues. But the government has also introduced very recently a new metrics of measuring growth. It's a complementary to the GDP, and it actually it's 15 indicators that also are structured around the 3 dimensions of sustainability, so economic, environmental, and social. So it's supposed to kind of add value and also capture people's quality of life in that index. So we're very keen on see how that is going and how we can take that forward. At the European level, our Prime Minister has taken the initiative together with the head of the European Commission to a social summit in Sweden later this year, where social dialogue will also be on top of the agenda at that meeting. On the global level, Sweden is also working to our international development cooperation with different innovative ways of working with public-private partnerships. So for example, we have projects in Ethiopia, Cambodia, and Bangladesh, especially at the textile and garment industry, where we are working with companies such as H&M, Swedish trade unions, global unions, ILO, and the government to see how we can create those public-private partnerships to have educations on the workplace, both for workers, but also for managers to understand what are the benefits that we can have on a dialogue. And if you have a chance, there is quite an interesting movie on the Global Deal website where there is examples both from Cambodia and Chile on how social dialogue has been used for people and for empowering also women in the workplace. But there are also other partners submitting their voluntary commitments, such as Argentina, but also civil society actors. So we are now looking at following up with the different partners that has joined to see what are the concrete action that the different partners are taking. And here it's one of the reasons why I'm in Canada, to see how we can strengthen our cooperation and how we can work together going forward. Let me come back a little bit to on the research side. Here we have commissioned a study last year looking specifically at the business case for social dialogue. And this is a short version of a larger academic piece which look exactly from a private sector perspective what the gains are of social dialogue. And one of the main findings of the study is actually that there is not a lot of research, but it at the same time says that it can really have positive benefits from for a private sector to have a functioning social dialogue. And I think at least in Sweden there is a growing recognition of that fact. So we're very excited to launch this study in Monday in New York, and also now are rolling out a couple of roundtable discussions around Europe to get input from different companies on the findings of this study to advance also the discussion that we have with the private sector. I will also tell you a little bit about some of the concrete plans going forward. As I said, it builds very much on individual commitments, but we have also, together with OECD and ILO, started to work on what we call the Global Deal Flagship Report. And that will look at the trends on social dialogue globally and with different countries. It will look at what are the commitments and best practices in this area, not only by countries, but with companies, but also for trade unions, and how can they be relevant and continue to be relevant when there is a decrease in trade union density in many countries. And the final part of that report will look at policy recommendations going forward and how the different actors can enhance social dialogue and sound industrial relations in their different areas of work. So that report will be kind of the follow-up structure of the global deal, and it will come every other year. That's the idea with it. So that report we hope to be launched, the first one early next year, and then to roll that out and have a discussions with partners around that. We also have a specific work stream looking more specifically on global deal and trade. And you mentioned the CETA, but also how do we strengthen that? I mean, for Canada and for most of the European countries, we want labor legislation and labor issues in this, but that's not the case for all. So what we are trying to do here is to create a platform where we can discuss the social aspects of trade in a more informal sector. So our Prime Minister has been discussing with the head of WTO for some time now to do a work stream on that. So that's something also that we will be launching this fall, and I will be able to tell you more about that. But also, how do we make sure that the partnership is long-term? I said, and I refer to the Prime Minister of Sweden, but his intention is really that this is a global multi-stakeholder partnership that is not a Swedish initiative, but has a long-term vision and that overlives elections or what it might be, but that it's really a global partnership that is owned by all the partners. So we're looking on how to create that long-term structure for the partnership. So that's some of the issues that we're working on now. I think I stopped there, and I look forward to your questions and comments and interventions. Thank you.
So we'll take some questions, and I guess that we do have a microphone at the back. I know the preference is to speak into the microphone so that the session's being recorded so that the question can be heard. So are there any questions to start, or perhaps I'll start with one while folks think about their questions. So one question I have, and you touched on it at the end, is how do you work or how does the global deal address, I think, what is a mounting problem of exacerbating differences in work conditions between developing countries, manufacturing zones, that kind of thing, export processing zones, and jobs that are in more developed economies like ours, and what can the global deal do to kind of address some of those inequalities?
I mean, I think what we can do in that regard is the companies that are engaged in the global deal. I mean, most of them have a supply chain in many developing countries. And if they start with education in their workplaces and putting, the emphasis there, but it's also about how we can politically talk with leaders that has joined the global deal where there is not a national legal framework for working on these issues. So I think, I think that's the strength with the global deal, that you have the government, you have the private sector side, the trade unions and other organizations, and you need the push from different levels. What I hear from companies that we want, for example, H&M. I mean, they are very strong on labor rights in their workplaces, even though they're sometimes criticized. But what they hear is that we need that platform to also discuss with the government and create that legal framework and the enabling environment at the national level in order for us to be able to work on these issues at our workplaces. So that's what I think we can do in terms of the global deal, having that multi-stakeholder perspective, having the businesses there which are active in the developing countries, but also the fact that the Prime Minister didn't want it to be a Nordic or a European initiative that was then imposed to developing countries, but he wanted to approach also developing countries in the beginning where these issues is not easy. So for example, Bangladesh, Colombia, and also Cambodia, where we are struggling quite a lot on some of the labor rights issues, were there from the beginning. And sometimes that's criticized, but what we are emphasizing there is that these are the countries that is needed the most. So if we don't work with them and continue to push that this is an important issue, we won't reach any progress. And I think Bangladesh Prime Minister has been in there, and she was also participating in the event we had on Monday. And having her there to hear also what others are saying and pushing the agenda, also with the bilateral consultation that Sweden has with the different countries, I think that can make a difference around the world, not only in developed countries, but also in the developing countries. And the global deal is about all countries. So not only developing, but also how do we work on these issues in our own country where we see there is a negative populist movement and a sense of not feeling included in society. So it's really about all countries, I would say.
Patrick LeBlanc, University of Ottawa. In your your opening remarks, you mentioned education, and I didn't hear among the stakeholders those involved in educating workers. So I don't know if you could speak to that. And I know you mentioned education with unions, companies, but they're not the ones really doing the education. So where's the educational stakeholder, if I can say?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, the global deal is broad, so education is one of the areas where you can use social dialogue to have the right education. And I think that's up for the different, for example, a country joins, then it's up for that specific country to include the stakeholders in that specific country in order to have that dialogue. So I think on a global level and in the global deal, there might not be so many education. But what we have seen is that if you use the social partners at the national level to have that dialogue on skills matching, but also lifelong learning. So I mean, if we, by having the countries there, also engage the different actors in the national context, I think the educational actors are there indirectly.
Rashmi Sharma from Global Affairs Canada. First of all, Ambassador, thank you very much for touching on the sort of central issues in development, and certainly for Agenda 2030, the one of inequality. What I wanted to ask you was a little more information on how to create the environment for better social dialogue. And I'm speaking from the perspective of Canada just becoming a member of the steering committee of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which is also a multi-stakeholder body that emerged out of the discussions on Paris Declaration and Accra Agenda for Action on Development Cooperation. And one of the central issues that we are discussing in the GPEDC, it's a very long acronym, is how to bring different stakeholders, in particular private sector and CSOs, on a more in a more trusting relationship and in a more trusting space. And I heard you mention Oxfam and of course trade unions, and these are members of GPEDC, and actually Bangladesh is one of the co-chairs. There are 3 co-chairs. It's Germany, Bangladesh, and Uganda. And I think one of the ways that is important now is to build links between initiatives such as the Global Deal and this GPEDC, and sort of trade lessons learned, and maybe seek some common platforms for social dialogue. Because one of the things that the GPEDC is trying to do is have country-level platforms for discussions. And if there were some exchanges made between Global Deal and the GPEDC, I think that could be a way. But one of the difficult areas that we are working in, and it became very evident in the last high-level meeting in Nairobi that took place, Sweden was there as well, is this building relations between stakeholders who don't have a history of dialogue. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you for that question. And I think, what we hope to build is that kind of platform to create that space of dialogue at both the global level, but also at the national level, of course. And there was actually a study coming out in April or May from the Overseas Development Institute looking at development cooperation and the decent work agenda. And from that study, it was clear, it was some European countries, I think it was 7 European countries, that on the decent work agenda, the social dialogue aspect was the one that has gotten almost no attention from any development actor, even in Europe. There was some projects by France and Sweden, but that was it. So, and also when I talk to the development cooperation people at the Commission, they see a huge potential for social dialogue in the development cooperation, because it has not been a very big issue there before. And so I think there is huge potential to work on social dialogue issues more in development cooperation. And I think you also touched upon a very important other thing, the area of different initiatives, and how do you bring those together and make sure there is no duplication, but that it's actually, creating added value and that they're connecting the dots between the different stakeholders. And there, I think we as an international community, we have to take that seriously and not competing with one another on different initiatives. And I think that's why we also worked with OECD and ILO from the beginning, because they are also in many of the other initiatives to draw on the wealth of experience that they have already and try to build on that. But there is still work to do to connect those dots, I would say, but at least we try to start. And I think bringing different actors together, that's what we want to do. And I think there is a recognition in general about the Sustainable Development Agenda that you have to have different actors on board, not only for Goal 8, but from all of the goals. So I think there is a recognition of it. I think there is an interest from the private sector, but that there is still a little bit of a gap on how we cooperate and speak the same language. And coming from New York, I was at the private sector launch with the Secretary General speaking exactly on this issue. And I heard there that it was still a little bit of a different languages being spoke by the development actors and the governments and the private sector, but there is a huge willingness and understanding that we have to take steps towards strengthening this cooperation and finding that common ground. So I'm very optimistic going forward, but I don't think it's easy.
Hi, my name is Ryan Federico, and I'm from World Vision Canada. And your comments on supply chains and wanting to improve labor conditions, especially in developing countries, caught my attention. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the effectiveness of supply chain transparency requirements. It's something that the UK has implemented, California, and I believe Australia and the Netherlands are looking at. And I was wondering if you can speak from your perspective and your experience if this is an effective way to go to improving labor conditions for the most vulnerable people in developing countries.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on supply issues, but I will answer from my perspective and from what I know. I mean, what I see is sometimes transparency in supply chain is also sometimes challenging for some of the companies. So it's, I guess, finding that balance. But there is a growing recognition of the importance of having a sustainable supply chain, looking at the G20 declarations recently. And also there is a fund, the German fund called Zero Vision Fund, which we hope can cooperate with as well. And from my conversation with the Swedish companies that are in the global deal, they see this as a crucial issue, because if there is not a functioning in their supply chain, it affects their whole productivity and their income. So it's not only about being morally right in the supply chain, but it's also about an economic gain for them to have that stability in the production chain. So from a company perspective, this is absolutely vital, and I think also, so it's the human rights perspective, moral perspective, but also the economic perspective of having sustainable supply chains. So.
Now I do feel like Vanna White. So much so that I have to put this down. Well, Ambassador, on behalf of CIGI, I'd like to thank you for sharing your perspectives and telling us more about the global deal and the initiative and the work that you're doing. I think it's really important work, and this has been a more positive conversation about labor and work than I'm accustomed to having, I have to say. I spend most of my time worrying about NAFTA these days, and it's not a particularly pleasant conversation, especially on the worker side. And so I think that you're touching on a lot of the issues that are very much alive, certainly in the North American context. As you said, this isn't something that's just for developing economies. These issues are very much alive in North America as well. And so thank you for coming. Thank you to all of you for being here today. On behalf of CIGI, I'd like to thank you for being here. I'd welcome you all to stay and enjoy the reception. We have some refreshments, and I'm always one to make sure that we have time for that. Thank you.